I am Nora, 29 years old, and somehow still healing from wounds my family inflicted. As a corporate restructuring specialist and forensic accountant, I escaped their toxicity by building my own empire, but I maintained occasional contact. On my 29th birthday, I asked my parents to have dinner with me. They told me they were too busy with urgent church business, so I went to an upscale restaurant by myself. But when I arrived, I found them eating there with my younger sister and her husband. Between sips of $500 champagne, my mother smirked and told me I was ruining their celebration. What I did next left the entire restaurant in shock. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to a family who underestimated your worth. Growing up in the affluent suburbs of Atlanta meant privilege to outsiders. But inside our sprawling home, emotional coldness permeated every corner. My father, Pastor Calvin, and my mother, First Lady Deidre, were obsessed with their image in our community. They led a massive congregation, and to the city we were the picture-perfect family. But behind closed doors, their love was entirely conditional. I was the eldest, but my sister Brianna was the golden child. She was the pageant queen, the socialite, the one who effortlessly fit their shallow expectations. I was the analytical one, the daughter who preferred numbers to debutante balls. They called me dry, cold, and ungrateful. They hated that I chose to study corporate finance instead of finding a wealthy husband to elevate their social standing. The rain was pouring down heavily as I handed my umbrella to the valet outside El Ora, Atlanta's most exclusive steakhouse. Getting a reservation here usually took 6 months, but I had my ways. I stepped into the dimly lit dining room listening to the soft jazz and the clinking of crystal glasses. I had spent the entire day alone. I just wanted a good meal and a quiet evening to process the fact that my own parents could not spare a single hour for me on my birthday. They had called me that morning with rushed apologies, claiming the church board needed them for a financial emergency. I believed them because I always wanted to believe them. The hostess smiled and led me toward a quiet booth in the back. As we walked past the raised VIP section, a sharp, familiar laugh cut through the ambient noise of the restaurant. I stopped dead in my tracks. There, sitting at the best table in the house, under a massive crystal chandelier, were my parents. Pastor Calvin was wearing his tailored custom suit, holding a glass of vintage champagne. My mother Deidre sat next to him wearing the exact diamond tennis bracelet I had purchased for her anniversary last month. Across from them sat Brianna dripping in designer labels, and her husband Trent. Trent was a white venture capitalist who loved to brag about his old money connections. My parents treated him like absolute royalty. They constantly paraded him around our church community to elevate their own status, acting as if his whiteness and supposed wealth validated our family in a way my hard work never could. They were not at an urgent board meeting. They were throwing a lavish dinner party, and I was deliberately excluded on my own birthday. My heart pounded against my ribs, but I did not turn around and leave. I walked directly up to their table. The moment Brianna saw me, her smile vanished. My mother froze with her champagne glass halfway to her lips. "Nora, what are you doing here?" Deidre snapped, not even trying to hide her displeasure. "I thought you had an urgent church board meeting, Mom," I said, keeping my voice perfectly level. My mother did not flinch. She set her glass down and sighed, looking at me as if I were a stain on the tablecloth. "Nora, do not make a scene. Trent just closed a massive deal for his firm today. We took them out to celebrate. We could not ruin his celebratory night with your gloomy energy. You have always been jealous of your sister's happiness, and we did not want you sitting here sulking." I stared at her, absorbing the casual cruelty of her words. "It is my birthday, Mom," I said quietly. "You lied to me on my birthday to throw a party for Trent." My father leaned forward, using his booming pastor voice to try and intimidate me. "Birthdays happen every year, Nora. Trent securing a new investment portfolio for Brianna's luxury event planning business is a real milestone. We are talking about building a legacy, something you would understand if you focused on building a family instead of auditing spreadsheets and living alone." Legacy. I repeated, feeling the anger finally push past the hurt. You mean like the time you begged me to co-sign Brianna's college loans because Trent was not around yet to fund her lifestyle? Brianna rolled her eyes dramatically, adjusting the silk sleeves of her blouse. Oh my gosh, Nora, are you still holding on to that? I paid you back in spirit. Why do you always have to bring up the past when we are trying to have a good time? You used that loan money to buy a Mercedes while I worked night shifts doing tax returns for small businesses to keep my own head above water, I reminded her. I ruined my credit for 3 years so you could look rich on campus. Deidre waved her hand dismissively. Stop acting like a martyr, Nora. We raised you to be strong because you do not have the natural charm your sister has. Brianna is delicate. She needs a different kind of support. Besides, Trent takes excellent care of her now. He provides for her the way a real man should. Trent leaned back in his leather chair, swirling his expensive cognac. He looked at me with that smug, condescending smile he always wore. Listen, Nora, there is no need for this hostility. I get it. You are single. You work a demanding corporate job that lacks any real creative passion. Seeing Brianna and me thriving must be difficult for you to process. Thriving, I said, staring directly into his pale eyes. Is that what you call it, Trent? He chuckled, a dry, arrogant sound. I call it success. I come from a family that understands how wealth works. We build things. We create generational wealth. We do not just look at other people's receipts and push paper like you do. But hey, it is your birthday. Let the hostess pack you a to-go box. Get a slice of cake. My treat. The sheer audacity of his offer made my blood run cold. He was sitting there playing the wealthy white savior to my black family, insulting my career, and offering me scraps from a table I was barred from joining. Generational wealth, Trent, I said slowly. Is that why you had to ask my parents to leverage the equity in their house last month? Pastor Calvin slammed his hand on the table, making the silverware rattle. Keep your voice down, Nora, he hissed, his face turning a dangerous shade of red. That is private family business. You have no right to speak about things you do not understand. Trent is expanding his firm, and we are proud to be early investors. It is called building a financial empire. I wanted to scream. I wanted to shake them and ask why they could not see past his shiny exterior. As a forensic accountant, I knew exactly what Trent's business looked like on paper. I had seen the red flags from a mile away. But before I could say another word, the waiter approached the table carrying a black leather folder. The bill had arrived. Trent grabbed the folder without even looking at the total. He pulled out a heavy metal platinum card and dropped it onto the small tray with a loud clink. Take care of this, my man, he told the waiter with an exaggerated wink. My father looked at me, a victorious gleam in his eye. You see that, Nora? That is how a real provider acts. Trent does not hesitate. You should take notes instead of carrying all this bitterness around. A man like Trent is a blessing to this family. I crossed my arms and waited. I did not have to wait long. A few minutes later, the waiter returned. He looked extremely uncomfortable, shifting his weight from side to side. He leaned down next to Trent, keeping his voice low, but not low enough to escape my ears. Sir, I am so sorry, but your card has been declined. Trent's smug expression instantly vanished. A dark flush crept up his neck. Declined. That is impossible. Run it again. I did, sir. I tried it 3 times. The terminal says the account is frozen. We need another form of payment. Brianna gasped, clutching Trent's arm. Trent? What is going on? I thought you said the new funding cleared this morning. Trent stammered, entirely losing his smooth composure. It is just a banking error, Brianna. Probably a security hold because the bill is large. You know how these fraud alerts are when you spend big money. They lock everything down. Deidre looked panicked. People at nearby tables were starting to stare at the commotion in the VIP section. The illusion of their perfect, wealthy evening was shattering in real time. My mother hated nothing more than public embarrassment. Calvin snatched the leather folder from the table and looked at the receipt. His eyes bulged slightly. $2,800. He looked at Trent, then at Brianna, and finally his harsh glare settled on me. Pay the bill, Nora, he demanded. I raised an eyebrow. Excuse me. You heard me. Pay the bill. Do not just stand there embarrassing us in front of the whole restaurant. Trent is dealing with a simple bank error. Step up and be a good daughter for once in your life. Cover the dinner. I looked at my mother, who was nodding vigorously. Yes, Nora, do not be petty. Pay the man so we can leave with our dignity intact. We will pay you back when Trent's bank opens on Monday. They were unbelievable. They had lied to me, abandoned me on my birthday, insulted my career, praised the man who replaced me in their affections, and now, without a single ounce of shame, they were demanding that I pay for the very dinner I was excluded from. I looked at Trent, who was staring at his phone, sweating profusely, completely stripped of his arrogant bravado. Then I looked at Brianna, who was practically shrinking into the booth. I opened my designer purse. I reached inside and pulled out my solid black American Express card. The heavy invite-only card that required a minimum annual spend they could not even fathom. I placed it gently onto the waiter's tray. My father scoffed, a sound of profound relief mixed with lingering contempt. See? Was that so hard, Nora? Family helps family. You finally did something useful today. The waiter walked away. Less than a minute later, he returned with the receipt. The transaction had gone through instantly. Approved without a single hitch. I picked up the pen and signed my name with slow, deliberate strokes. I handed the folder back to the waiter. Then I looked directly at the restaurant manager, who had rushed over to our table to apologize for the awkward scene with the declined card. Manager, I called out, my voice clear and carrying across the quiet dining room. Yes, ma'am, the manager replied, standing at attention. I pointed at my parents. Cancel their VIP membership immediately. Deidre gasped, her hand flying to her chest. Nora, what are you doing? You cannot do that. We are personal friends with the owner. I smiled, a slow, cold smile that made my father physically recoil. No, Mom, you are not. Because the owner sold this property 6 months ago. I turned my attention back to the manager. Actually, as the owner of this commercial building, I am officially terminating the restaurant's lease if this man I pointed directly at Trent is ever allowed inside my property again. Ensure his face is given to security. The entire table froze. The silence that fell over the VIP section was absolute. Trent looked like he had stopped breathing. Brianna's jaw was practically on the floor. My father's booming pastor voice was completely gone, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated terror. You own the building, Deidre whispered, her voice trembling. I picked up my purse and looked down at the family that had spent 29 years making me feel completely worthless. Yes, Mom, I own the building. I own the holding company that manages this entire block. That dry, embarrassing corporate job you all love to mock pays very well. Oh, and Trent, I leaned closer to my pale, sweating brother-in-law. The bank did not make an error. The feds froze your accounts. You might want to skip dessert and call a defense attorney. I did not wait for their response. I turned my back on their shocked, terrified faces and walked out of the restaurant, leaving them sitting in the mess they had created. The morning after the dinner at the restaurant, I arrived at my office well before sunrise. The adrenaline from the previous night was still buzzing through my veins, but my mind was entirely clear. As a corporate restructuring specialist and forensic accountant, I was used to untangling financial disasters. I made my living digging through ledgers, tracking hidden offshore accounts, and dismantling the lies of corrupt executives. But nothing could have prepared me for the financial mess my own family had willingly walked into. My office was located on the 40th floor of a sleek glass building overlooking the Atlanta skyline. It was a space I had earned through years of grueling 80-hour work weeks. It was quiet and professional and secure, or so I thought. It was barely 9 in the morning when the heavy glass doors of my suite swung open with violent force. My assistant tried to step in their way, but she was no match for the sheer entitlement of Pastor Calvin and First Lady Deidre. My parents marched into my office wearing their church authority-like armor. My father was dressed in a sharp charcoal suit, his jaw set in a hard line of righteous fury. My mother followed close behind, clutching a designer handbag that I knew cost more than my first car. They did not look like parents coming to check on their daughter after a disastrous birthday dinner. They looked like a judge and jury preparing to hand down a sentence. I did not stand up. I simply folded my hands on my mahogany desk and waited for the storm to hit. My father did not waste any time. He slammed his hand down on the surface of my desk, scattering a stack of audit reports. "Have you completely lost your mind, Nora?" he shouted, his booming pastor voice filling the quiet corporate space. "How dare you humiliate your sister and her husband in front of the entire restaurant? We had to spend the rest of the evening doing damage control because you threw a childish temper tantrum over a declined credit card." I looked at him calmly. "A declined credit card that belonged to your supposedly wealthy son-in-law," I reminded him. My mother stepped forward, her eyes flashing with that familiar disappointed glare she always reserved just for me. "It was a bank error, Nora. A simple security hold because Trent makes large international transfers for his venture capital firm. You made a spectacle out of a simple glitch. You embarrassed us in front of the waitstaff and the management. Trent comes from a good family. He is elevating our status in this city. He is bringing high-net-worth investors to our church, and you treated him like a common criminal just because you have always been jealous of Brianna." The casual way she defended him made my stomach turn. They were so blinded by Trent and his white privilege, his promises of old money and elite connections, that they could not see the parasite standing right in front of them. "I am not jealous of Brianna," I said, keeping my voice perfectly level. "I am disgusted that you would lie to me on my birthday to throw a party for a man who cannot even pay for his own dinner." My father pointed a shaking finger at me. "Do not speak about Trent that way. He is a blessing to this family. He treats your sister like a queen. He provides for her. He is building a legacy while you sit alone in this office, nursing your bitterness. You have always tried to sabotage your sister. You have never supported her dreams. Just like when you maliciously refused to co-sign her college loans. You tried to ruin her future back then, and you are trying to ruin her marriage now." The audacity of that statement was staggering. I leaned back in my leather chair, staring at the man who was supposed to protect me, but only ever protected his own image. "You mean the student loans she needed because she blew through her tuition money?" I asked. "You mean the loans she used to buy a brand new Mercedes while I was working night shifts doing tax returns at 2 in the morning to pay for my own accounting degree?" I refused to co-sign because I knew she would never pay it back, and I was not going to let her destroy my credit before my career even started. My mother scoffed, waving her hand dismissively. "That is exactly what we mean, Nora. You are selfish. You have always been selfish. You hoard your money and your success, and you refuse to share your blessings with your own blood. Brianna is delicate. She deserves nice things. Trent understands that. He understands how to treat a woman of her caliber. And last night you stressed him out so much with your petty display that his bank flagged his accounts for suspicious activity." I almost laughed at the absolute absurdity of her logic. Trent had convinced them that my actions at the restaurant were the reason his accounts were locked. He was spinning a web of desperate lies to cover his tracks, and my parents were swallowing every single word. "He is currently dealing with a massive liquidity issue because of the scene you caused." My father added, his voice dropping into a tone of absolute command. "He had an investment transfer scheduled for this morning, and now his capital is tied up in security holds. He needs cash to clear the transactions and save the deal." I tilted my head, studying their faces. "And let me guess. You came here to ask me for money." "We are not asking, Nora," my mother said, stepping up to the edge of the desk. "We are telling you. You are going to transfer $50,000 to Trent's management account immediately. It is the least you can do to fix the banking error you caused. Consider it an apology for your disgraceful behavior last night." I sat in silence for a long moment, simply absorbing the sheer magnitude of their delusion. They had barged into my workplace, insulted my character, blamed me for their son-in-law's financial failures, and were now demanding $50,000 as an apology. It was textbook manipulation, a dynamic I had suffered under for 29 years. But I was no longer the frightened teenager trying to earn their conditional love. "I will not be giving you or Trent a single dime," I said quietly. My father's face twisted into a mask of pure rage. You will do as you are told, Nora. If you do not transfer that money right now, I will go before the entire congregation this Sunday and announce that my eldest daughter has lost her mind. I will tell the church elders that you are mentally unstable and consumed by greed. I will have you completely excommunicated from our family and smeared across the entire Atlanta community. You will have no family left. You will be completely alone. He delivered the threat with the practiced ease of a man who was used to using his spiritual authority to crush anyone who opposed him. He expected me to beg. He expected me to cry and apologize and write the check just to keep the peace. He expected the old Nora, but the old Nora was dead. Dad, I said, my voice dropping to a whisper, so cold it made my mother flinch. You cannot excommunicate me from a family I have already outgrown, and you cannot threaten a woman who holds all the cards. I reached forward and placed my hands on my computer monitor. You think Trent is a venture capitalist? You think he comes from old money and is building a financial empire for Brianna? You think I embarrassed him last night because I am jealous. I slowly turned the large monitor around so it faced them directly. I am a forensic accountant. Mom, I continued, tapping the screen. I do not just look at spreadsheets. I hunt hidden money. I dismantle shell companies. And when I saw the red flags around your precious son-in-law, I did a little digging into his highly exclusive management firm. My parents stared at the screen, their eyes darting across the complex financial documents and legal filings illuminated on the monitor. I will not give you $50,000, I said, leaning forward over the desk. But you should probably call your son-in-law right now and ask him why the Federal Bureau of Investigation flagged his accounts for wire fraud at 6 o'clock this morning. My mother let out a small, breathless gasp, her hands gripping the edge of my desk as she stared at the official government seals on the documents displayed before her. And while you have him on the phone, I added, my voice slicing through the heavy silence of the office, you might also want to ask him why the deed to your house, the mansion you spent 20 years paying off, is currently listed as the primary collateral for his $2 million business loan. The silence in my office was absolute after I dropped that revelation. My parents stood frozen by my desk, unable to comprehend the financial ruin I had just laid out before them. I did not wait for them to find their voices. I simply called security and had them escorted from the building. The rest of my workday was a blur of legal calls and unyielding focus. I left the office late that evening, craving nothing more than the quiet sanctuary of my own home. My penthouse apartment in Midtown was my safe haven. I had bought it with my own money, designed every inch of it to my own taste, and protected it fiercely from my family. I poured myself a glass of Cabernet Sauvignon and stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, watching the Atlanta traffic far below. I thought the worst of the storm had passed for the day. I was entirely wrong. The frantic pounding on my front door started just before 9 o'clock. It was not a polite knock. It was the desperate, entitled pounding of someone who believed the world should stop spinning for them. I checked the security monitor and let out a heavy sigh. It was Brianna. My younger sister was pacing in the hallway outside my door, wiping her eyes and looking like a tragedy in a designer trench coat. I debated leaving her out there, but I knew she would just alert the building management and cause a scene. I unlocked the door and pulled it open. Brianna pushed past me without a word of greeting. She threw her expensive handbag onto my kitchen island and immediately burst into loud, dramatic sobs. It was a performance I had seen 1,000 times before. Growing up, whenever Brianna wanted something or needed to escape the consequences of her own actions, she would turn on the waterworks. My parents would immediately rush to comfort her and usually punish me in the process. But I was not our parents, and I was immune to her golden tears. "What do you want, Brianna?" I asked, closing the door and leaning against it. She spun around to face me, her face streaked with tears that somehow had not ruined her perfect makeup. "How could you do this, Nora?" she screamed, her voice echoing off my high ceilings. "How could you try to destroy my marriage out of pure spite? Trent is a good man. He was just making a business transfer and you had to go and stick your nose where it does not belong." I walked slowly into the kitchen, keeping the island between us. Stick my nose where it does not belong, I repeated calmly. Brianna, your husband, used mom and dad as collateral for a $2 million loan to keep his fraudulent company afloat. The federal government flagged his accounts for wire fraud. I did not destroy anything. Trent built a house of cards and the wind finally blew. You are lying, she cried, slamming her hands down on the marble countertop. Trent explained everything to me. He said you misunderstood the financial filings because you are just a low-level accountant who does not understand high-level venture capital. He said you purposefully triggered a fraud alert because you were embarrassed about the restaurant last night. You have always been jealous of me, Nora. You have always hated that mom and dad love me more. You hate that I found a wealthy man to take care of me while you sit alone in this apartment with nobody to love you. Her words were designed to cut deep to hit all the insecurities my mother had planted in my head since childhood. But looking at her now frantic and defending a man who was actively robbing our family blind, I only felt pity. I am not jealous of a woman whose husband is facing federal indictment, Brianna, I said, pouring myself another glass of wine. And if you had an ounce of sense, you would be calling a divorce lawyer instead of screaming at me. Brianna stared at me, her chest heaving. Then she played her ultimate card, the one she thought would force me into submission. Her face crumbled into a look of absolute desperation. You cannot let him go to jail. Nora, she sobbed, grabbing the edge of the counter. Please, you have to fix this. You have to tell the bank you made a mistake. I am pregnant. The words hung in the air between us. For a fraction of a second, my heart stopped. A baby. My sister was pregnant with the child of a con artist. A wave of protective sisterly instinct washed over me, a remnant of the girl who used to defend Brianna on the playground before she learned to use me as a human shield. But as a forensic auditor, I was trained to observe everything. I was trained to look past the emotional presentation and analyze the raw data of human behavior. Brianna was crying heavily now, her shoulders shaking with the force of her sobs. She reached out blindly across the counter, her hand wrapping around the open bottle of Cabernet I had left near the cutting board. Still sobbing about the supposed baby and her ruined future, she grabbed a clean wine glass from the drying rack, poured herself a generous amount of the dark red wine, and brought it to her lips. She took a massive gulp, swallowing the alcohol easily, before setting the glass down and looking at me with wide, tear-filled eyes. Please, Nora, she begged again. Think about your niece or nephew. I looked at the wine glass. Then I looked at her flat stomach. The protective instinct evaporated instantly, replaced by a cold, sharp clarity. You are sipping a very dry vintage Cabernet while begging me to save the father of your unborn child, I said, my voice dropping to a flat monotone. You are not pregnant, Brianna. You are just panicking. Brianna froze. Her eyes darted from the wineglass in her hand back to my face. The realization of her own stupid mistake washed over her. The tears stopped immediately. The hysterical sobbing vanished like a switched-off television. Her posture straightened, and the fragile victim persona melted away, revealing the vicious, entitled woman beneath. You are such a cold, unfeeling person, she sneered, setting the glass down so hard the stem nearly snapped. No wonder you do not have a family of your own. You do not care about anyone but yourself. You are trying to ruin Trent because you want to be the only successful person in this family. You want mom and dad to come crawling to you. Before I could tell her to get out of my home, the front door opened again. Brianna had left it unlocked in her frantic entrance. Heavy, confident footsteps echoed in the foyer. Trent walked into my living room, and he did not look like the sweating, panicked man from the restaurant the night before. He was dressed in a sharp navy suit, his posture rigid with unearned authority. He looked around my penthouse with a sneer of clear disdain before his pale eyes locked onto me. Behind him walked a man I did not recognize. He was older, balding, and carrying a thick leather briefcase. He had the unmistakable aura of a corporate defense attorney, the kind of lawyer who specialized in bullying people into silence. Trent stepped up beside my sister, placing a possessive hand on her shoulder. Brianna instantly leaned into him, playing the part of the fragile wife under attack. Enough of this nonsense, Nora, Trent said, his voice dripping with condescension. You have had your fun. You threw your little temper tantrum and caused a massive headache for my firm. But the adults are here now and playtime is over. I folded my arms over my chest, refusing to back down from his physical intimidation. You have a lot of nerve breaking into my home, Trent, especially when you should be shredding documents before the federal agents raid your office. Trent offered a patronizing chuckle. He shook his head, looking at his lawyer as if I were a confused child. You really think you hold any power here, Nora? You think because you pushed some numbers around on a spreadsheet that you understand how the real world operates. People like me do not go to jail for administrative banking errors. We have connections, we have resources. But a black woman in corporate America who breaches client confidentiality to settle a petty family dispute, you will be unemployable by tomorrow morning. I will personally see to it that your career is destroyed. He was weaponizing his white privilege openly, using the very dynamic my parents worshipped to threaten my livelihood. He truly believed that his status would shield him from the consequences of his fraud, and that my identity made me an easy target to crush. The lawyer stepped forward, opening his briefcase and placing a thick stack of legal documents on my kitchen island right next to Brianna's half-empty wine glass. Ms. Wilson, the lawyer, began, his tone smooth and oily. My client is willing to overlook your egregious breach of professional ethics. We understand that family dynamics can be emotional, and sometimes people make rash decisions out of jealousy. We have drafted a non-disclosure agreement and a formal affidavit of error. I stared at the documents, then looked up at the lawyer. An affidavit of error, I asked. Yes, Trent interrupted, stepping closer to the counter. You are going to sign that document stating that you accessed my financial files illegally and that you misinterpreted the data. You are going to formally withdraw the red flags you placed on my accounts. Once you sign this, the bank will unfreeze my assets, my deal will go through, and your parents will not lose their house. If you do not sign it, I will sue your accounting firm for defamation and breach of fiduciary duty. Your boss will fire you before lunch. He leaned across the marble counter, his face inches from mine. His breath smelled of stale coffee and panic masked by arrogance. You are going to fix this, Nora. You owe this family. You owe Brianna. Sign the paper and we can all go back to normal. I did not back away from him. I calmly reached out and pulled the thick stack of legal documents toward me. I could feel Trent and Brianna watching me, their eyes hungry for my submission. They expected me to crumble under the threat of losing my career. They thought the fear of being sued, of losing everything I had built, would force me to obey. I flipped past the first page of the non-disclosure agreement. The lawyer had drafted it to look like a standard retraction of professional audit findings. It was full of dense legal jargon designed to confuse and overwhelm. But Trent forgot one crucial detail. I was not just an accountant. I was a specialist in corporate restructuring. I spent my days reading the fine print that other people ignored. I lived in the details that criminals use to hide their sins. I ignored the signature pages and flipped directly to the attached exhibits at the back of the document. If Trent was this desperate to get my signature tonight, it meant there was something in this paperwork that went far beyond a simple apology. He needed something from me to unlock those frozen funds. My eyes scanned the dense paragraphs of Exhibit C, which detailed the primary loan structure for Trent Management Firm. I saw the listing for my parents' house serving as collateral, just as I had discovered earlier. But then my eyes caught another paragraph buried deep within the liability clauses. It was a section outlining the primary guarantor of the $2 million commercial loan. The blood in my veins turned to ice. I stopped breathing for a fraction of a second as I read the name listed as the ultimate financial backer for Trent Fraudulent Empire. It was my name, Nora Wilson. I looked at the date on the original loan application attached to the exhibit. It was dated 8 months ago, right around the time Trent had asked me to review some preliminary business plans for Brianna Event Company under the guise of wanting my professional advice. I had refused to work for him, but he had somehow gained access to my personal financial data. I read further down the page. The document Trent and his lawyer were demanding I sign tonight was not just a retraction of my audit findings. Hidden beneath layers of complex legal terminology was a ratification clause. By signing this document, I would be legally acknowledging and confirming the validity of all exhibits attached. Trent had not just forged my father's signature to steal the equity from my parents' house. He had forged my signature to make me the primary guarantor of his massive $2 million loan. He used my immaculate credit score, my high corporate salary, and my spotless financial history to secure the funding for his scam. And because the feds had frozen his accounts, the bank was going to come looking for the guarantor to cover the debt. He needed me to sign this new document tonight to legitimize the forged signature from 8 months ago, making me entirely responsible for his crimes. I slowly lowered the document and looked up at Trent. He was watching me with a tight, strained smile, clearly hoping I had not read the fine print. Brianna stood beside him, looking impatient, oblivious to the fact that her husband had just tried to financially ruin her own sister to save himself. I realized the absolute depth of his trap. He had weaponized my family against me, and now he was trying to steal my entire future. The betrayal was so profound, so meticulously evil, that it left me completely breathless. I placed my hands flat on the marble counter, locking my gaze with the man who thought he had finally broken me. He had no idea what kind of war he had just started. I slid the heavy stack of legal documents back across the cool marble of my kitchen island. Trent watched my hand move his arrogant smirk, faltering just slightly at the edges. I looked at the corporate defense attorney standing next to him and asked if he made a habit of presenting fraudulent ratification documents to conceal federal crimes. The lawyer shifted his weight, his eyes darting toward Trent. Brianna let out a dramatic sigh and crossed her arms over her chest, complaining that I was always trying to sound smarter than everyone else. I ignored her and told Trent to get out of my penthouse before I called the police to report a home invasion and attempted extortion. Trent stepped closer to me, his face turning a mottled red. He told me I was making the biggest mistake of my life. He said I was just a bitter, lonely woman who could not stand to see her younger sister being treated like a queen. He promised me that by the time he was done with me, I would not be able to find a job as a bank teller in the city. I did not blink. I picked up my phone and dialed building security. Trent snatched the legal documents from the counter, grabbed Brianna by the arm, and stormed out of my apartment with his lawyer trailing nervously behind them. The heavy oak door slammed shut, leaving me alone in the sudden quiet. I stood in my kitchen for a long time, listening to the distant hum of the city traffic below. My hands were perfectly steady. The adrenaline had burned away, leaving only a sharp, icy focus. I unlocked my phone and dialed my parents' home number. I knew they were awake. Pastor Calvin and First Lady Deidre were always awake at this hour, plotting their next social maneuver or polishing their public image. My father answered on the second ring, his voice dropping into that deep, authoritative register he used behind the pulpit. He asked if I had finally come to my senses and signed the banking error correction for Trent. He told me the family was willing to forgive my embarrassing outburst at the restaurant if I just cooperated and transferred the $50,000 as a peace offering. I did not raise my voice. I spoke directly into the receiver and told my father that his precious son-in-law was not a venture capitalist. I told him Trent had forged my signature 8 months ago to secure a $2 million commercial loan. I told him Trent was under federal investigation and had just tried to trick me into signing a ratification document to make me legally responsible for his massive debt. I waited for the gasp of horror. I waited for my father to express outrage that a man had stolen his daughter's identity. I waited for the protective fury that any normal parent would feel when their child is put in legal jeopardy. Instead, a heavy, suffocating silence fell over the line. When the silence broke, it was not my father who spoke. My mother had picked up the extension in the kitchen. Her voice was cold, precise, and entirely devoid of shock. "We knew about the signature, Nora," she said. The words hit me like a physical blow. The air in my lungs simply vanished. I asked her to repeat herself, hoping my mind was playing tricks on me, hoping I had misunderstood the sheer malice in her tone. My mother sighed, the sound conveying nothing but supreme irritation. She told me Trent came to them months ago when he was putting together the capital to expand Brianna luxury event planning business. She said Trent needed a clean guarantor because Brianna had terrible credit. A credit score, my mother quickly reminded me, that was ruined because I had selfishly refused to co-sign her student loans years ago. My mother spoke with a chilling pragmatism. She said, "You sit up in that penthouse making a ridiculous amount of money, Nora. You have no husband to support. You have no children to provide for. What exactly are you doing with all that good credit anyway? You owe this family." I stood frozen, staring at my reflection in the dark kitchen window. My own mother and father had facilitated identity theft against me. They had handed my financial life over to a parasite because he looked the part of a wealthy white savior, and because they deemed my life as a single independent black woman to be utterly worthless unless it was being harvested to fund my sister. My father came back on the line, his voice hardening into a direct threat. He told me I was going to call Trent, apologize for my disrespect, and sign that document immediately. He said family sacrifices for family, and my credit score was a small price to pay for Brianna happiness. If I chose to be stubborn and drag his son-in-law down, my father promised he would use every connection he had in Atlanta to destroy me. He reminded me that he played golf with the senior partners at my accounting firm. He said he would call them in the morning and have me fired for unethical family harassment. He told me I would be left with nothing but my pride, and that pride does not pay a mortgage. He hung up the phone before I could respond. I did not sleep that night. I sat at my dining table with my laptop pulling every public record, every corporate filing, and every piece of data I could legally access regarding Trent and his shell companies. By the time the sun began to rise over the Atlanta skyline, I had mapped out his entire fraudulent network. I showered, dressed in my sharpest tailored suit, and drove to my firm. The corporate restructuring and forensic accounting division occupied 3 floors of a massive glass tower in the financial district. I walked to my office, ignoring the knot of tension in my stomach. I knew my father was not bluffing. Pastor Calvin wielded his megachurch congregation like a weapon. He controlled millions of dollars in church accounts, and he knew exactly how to pressure corporate executives. I had barely set my briefcase down when my desk phone rang. It was the executive assistant for Marcus Sterling, the managing partner of our division. She told me Marcus needed to see me in his office immediately. I walked down the long corridor, the thick carpet muffling my footsteps. I prepared myself mentally to pack my desk. I knew how corporate politics worked. A high-net-worth client threatening to pull massive accounts over a supposedly unstable employee was usually a death sentence for a career. I knocked on the heavy glass door and Marcus waved me inside. He was a ruthless pragmatist, a man who cared only about numbers and liability. Marcus turned around and leaned against his desk. He looked at me for a long time before speaking. He told me he had received a very disturbing phone call at 7 in the morning from a Pastor Calvin. Marcus said my father claimed I was having a severe mental breakdown. My father had told the managing partner that I was obsessively harassing my sister's husband, trying to extort money from their church, and breaching professional ethics by looking into their private accounts. Marcus picked up a silver pen and turned it over in his hands. He said my father threatened to move the megachurch entire pension fund and operating accounts to a rival firm if I was not terminated by noon. My father had painted me as a massive corporate liability, a bitter, unhinged woman who was trying to tear down a respectable family out of pure jealousy. I stood perfectly still, keeping my face an unreadable mask. I told Marcus that I understood if the firm needed to sever ties to protect its assets. I did not offer excuses or tearful explanations. I did not try to defend my character against my own blood. I simply maintained my professional dignity, ready to accept the fallout of my family total betrayal. I told Marcus I would have my office packed within the hour. Marcus let out a sharp, sudden laugh. He tossed the silver pen onto his desk and shook his head. He told me to sit down. He walked around to his leather chair and pulled a thick red file from his top drawer. Marcus told me that Pastor Calvin made one critical miscalculation when he tried to leverage the firm. My father assumed the bank holding Trent massive commercial loan was keeping the matter quiet. He assumed the fraud investigation was a minor internal hurdle that could be swept under the rug with enough bullying. But Marcus explained that our firm works directly with the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation and the major commercial lenders in this district. Marcus slid the thick red file across the polished wood of his desk until it stopped directly in front of me. He told me that at 8 o'clock this morning, the primary lender officially declared Trent Management Firm to be in total default due to credible evidence of wire fraud and forged guarantees. The bank had immediately moved to seize all associated collateral to recoup the $2 million before Trent could hide the assets offshore. And because the financial web Trent had woven was so complex, involving church funds, event planning businesses, and stolen identities, the bank needed an external forensic liquidator to tear the shell companies apart. Marcus looked me dead in the eye and told me the bank specifically requested our firm to handle the asset seizure. And because of my flawless track record in dismantling fraudulent corporate structures, Marcus had decided to assign me as the lead liquidator on the case. I stared at the red file resting under my fingertips. The name of Trent Shell Company was printed boldly across the tab. Marcus told me I was not being fired. He told me I was being handed the keys to the castle. I slowly opened the file and looked at the primary collateral listed for immediate seizure. It was the deed to my parents' sprawling suburban mansion. I looked at the secondary assets, which included all the equipment and capital belonging to Brianna luxury event planning business. By trying to get me fired and cut off my resources, my parents had inadvertently fast-tracked their own destruction. They had handed my boss the exact motivation he needed to put me in charge. I looked back up at Marcus and nodded. I told him I would be happy to take the assignment. I closed the red file, feeling a new kind of power settle into my bones. I walked out of his office knowing that I now legally controlled my family's entire financial life and death. The invitation to my parents' house came the very next evening in the form of a calendar invite. It was titled Family Healing and Prayer Session. Under normal circumstances, I would have deleted it without a second thought. But knowing what I now knew about the house of cards Trent had built and my parents' role in it, I decided to attend. I pulled my car into the long, sweeping driveway of the estate I grew up in. The sprawling brick mansion sat on 2 acres of perfectly manicured land. It was a monument to Pastor Calvin and First Lady Deidre and their obsession with image. The driveway was packed with luxury vehicles. I recognized the cars belonging to my aunts and uncles and several of the senior elders from my parents' megachurch. This was not a private family meeting. It was an ambush. I walked through the heavy double doors, and the dull hum of conversation in the formal living room instantly stopped. Every eye turned toward me. The room was arranged like a courtroom. My parents sat together on the velvet love seat looking somber and pious. Brianna sat next to Trent on the matching sofa, clutching his hand and resting her other hand on her perfectly flat stomach. Surrounding them in a tight circle were 4 church elders, my Aunt Beatrice and my Uncle Thomas. They all looked at me with varying expressions of pity and profound disappointment. "Come in, Nora," my father said, his voice dripping with forced pastoral compassion. "Have a seat. We have been waiting for you." I walked into the center of the room, but I did not sit down. I stood facing them, observing the ridiculous spectacle they had orchestrated. I asked my father why half the church board was sitting in his living room on a Thursday night. My mother let out a heavy theatrical sigh. She dabbed at her dry eyes with a tissue. "We called an intervention, Nora. We are terrified for you. Your behavior over the past few days has been erratic and deeply disturbing. We brought the elders here to pray over you and to help you see the darkness that has taken root in your heart." One of the elders, an older man who had known me since childhood, shook his head sadly. "Nora, your parents came to us in tears today. They told us how you have been harassing your sister and her husband. They told us you had a mental breakdown at the restaurant and tried to ruin Trent's business out of pure spite. This is not the behavior of a good Christian woman." I looked at the elder, then at my mother. They had spun a completely fabricated narrative to protect Trent's fraud, and they were using my single status as proof of my supposed insanity. "You need professional help, Nora," my mother said, leaning forward. "You are 29 years old and completely alone. You have no husband and no children. You have poured your entire life into a cold, empty corporate job, and it has made you bitter. You cannot stand to see Brianna happy. You cannot stand that she found a wonderful, successful white man who treats her like royalty. Your jealousy is rotting you from the inside out. Brianna sniffled, burying her face in Trent's shoulder. She has always hated me, she cried softly so the whole room could hear. She has always tried to sabotage my happiness, just because I got everything she wanted. Aunt Beatrice slammed her teacup down on its saucer. The sharp clinking sound echoed in the quiet room. Brianna is absolutely right, she sneered, glaring at me. You have always been a selfish, greedy girl, Nora. It has always been about you and your money. Do you remember when you refused to let Brianna wear your grandmother's pearl necklace for her wedding? You hid those pearls away like a miser, refusing to share a piece of family history on your own sister's special day. You broke her heart. I turned my gaze to Aunt Beatrice. I kept the pearls locked in a safe deposit box because Brianna did not want to wear them down the aisle. I said, my voice completely steady. She wanted to sell them to a pawn shop to pay for Trent's lavish bachelor party in Las Vegas. Brianna gasped in fake horror. That is a lie, she shouted. I would never do that. My father stood up, raising his hands to calm the room. Enough, he commanded. We are not here to bicker about the past. We are here to save Nora from herself and to save this family from the financial disaster she has maliciously caused. Trent finally stood up, smoothing the front of his expensive suit. He looked at me with a look of supreme confidence. He knew he had the entire room on his side. He stepped forward and pulled a thick manila folder from his jacket. He placed it on the glass coffee table between us. Listen, Nora, Trent began, his tone patronizing and incredibly smug. I know you are dealing with some heavy emotional issues right now. I know my success is intimidating to you, but your little stunt with the bank yesterday crossed a line. You used your position at your firm to harass my investors and freeze my operating accounts. You put my entire management firm at risk. But because I love your sister and because I respect your parents, I am willing to offer you a way out. He tapped the manila folder. I had my lawyers draft a new contract this afternoon. It is a simple asset transfer agreement. You are going to sign the assets of your commercial holding company over to my management firm, Nora. My team will take control of your real estate portfolio. The revenue from your properties will be used to cover the temporary debt I incurred because of your interference. It will unfreeze my accounts, and most importantly, it will save your parents' house. I looked at the folder on the table. He was genuinely trying to steal my entire real estate holding company under the guise of an intervention. And what do I get out of this incredibly generous offer? I asked, my tone completely flat. Trent smiled, revealing his bright white teeth. In exchange for your properties, I will not press criminal charges for your harassment. I will drop the lawsuit against your accounting firm. You get to keep your little job, and you get to stay out of jail. It is a win for everyone. My mother rushed to add her voice to his. Nora, this is your chance to make things right. Trent is giving you an opportunity to redeem yourself. Sign the papers. Give him the holding company. You do not need all those buildings anyway. You are just hoarding wealth while your sister is trying to build a family. Be a good Christian daughter and do what is right for your parents. The elders nodded in solemn agreement, murmuring their approval of Trent's extreme generosity. Aunt Beatrice crossed her arms and told me I should be on my knees thanking him for not putting me behind bars. My father looked at me with hard, commanding eyes, ordering me to pick up the pen and stop acting like a fool. They had cornered me in the very house where I grew up, surrounding me with the people I used to respect. They were using faith and guilt and family duty to strip me of everything I had built with my own 2 hands. They were willing to sacrifice my entire future just to maintain the illusion that Trent was a savior. I looked at my mother. She was staring at me with a cold, calculating expectation. She truly believed I would fold. She believed that 29 years of emotional conditioning would kick in and I would sacrifice myself on the altar of Brianna's happiness. I walked forward and picked up the contract. The room collectively held its breath. I flipped through the pages, reading the dense legal text. Trent's lawyer had drafted it exactly as Trent described. It was an absolute transfer of ownership. It legally bound the signatory to hand over all assets and all liabilities of the named holding company directly to Trent's venture capital firm. It was a blank check giving him total control over the corporate entity. I reached into my purse and pulled out my favorite fountain pen. My father let out a loud breath of relief. "Praise God," he said, his voice echoing with triumphant joy. "The Lord is working in this room tonight." Brianna clapped her hands together, bouncing on the sofa. "I knew you would do the right thing, Nora," she squealed. "Now Trent and I can finally focus on the baby without all this awful stress you caused." I did not look up. I turned to the final page of the document. I placed the paper on the glass coffee table. I uncapped my pen and signed my name on the dotted line with smooth, confident strokes. The moment the ink dried, the room erupted. Aunt Beatrice clapped loudly, praising my parents for raising a daughter who finally learned her place. The elders murmured blessings over Trent, thanking him for his grace and mercy. My mother wiped a genuine tear of joy from her eye, looking at Trent as if he had just performed a miracle. Trent snatched the contract off the table the second my pen lifted. He looked at my signature, and a massive, victorious grin spread across his face. He actually laughed out loud, holding the paper up like a trophy. "I told you," he said, looking at Brianna. "I told you she would cave. They always cave when you put the pressure on." He turned back to me, his expression dripping with arrogant superiority. "Good girl, Nora," he mocked. "I will have my team file this with the state first thing in the morning. You can go back to your lonely little apartment now. We have real family business to discuss." I put the cap back on my fountain pen and dropped it into my purse. I stood up straight, adjusting the cuffs of my blazer. I looked at the cheering family, at my parents glowing with pride, at Brianna resting her hand on her fake baby bump, and at Trent holding the contract that he thought just saved his life. I allowed myself a slow, genuine smile. "Congratulations, Trent," I said, my voice cutting through the celebratory noise with razor-sharp precision. The room quieted down, confused by my tone. Trent frowned, clutching the folder tightly to his chest. "What are you talking about?" he demanded. I pointed to the contract in his hands. "You should really learn to read the fine print before you try to steal from a forensic accountant," I said. "You demanded I sign over the assets of my holding company. So I did. I signed over Aegis Holdings, LLC. Trent stared at me, his pale eyes narrowing. "So what?" he snapped. "It is mine now." I shook my head slowly. "Yes, Trent. It is yours. You just signed a legally binding document assuming total ownership of all assets and all liabilities for Aegis Holdings, which is fascinating because Aegis Holdings is a dummy shell company I acquired 3 days ago." The color began to drain from Trent's face. My parents stopped smiling. I took a step toward him. "Aegis Holdings has exactly $0 in assets," I explained, watching the terror dawn in his eyes. "But it has about $5 million in liabilities. It is currently under federal investigation for massive tax evasion and corporate fraud. The previous owners abandoned it to avoid prison. And you just gave the federal government a signed confession claiming you are the sole owner and legally responsible party for the entire mess." Brianna let out a high-pitched gasp. Trent stumbled backward, the manila folder slipping from his hands and scattering across the floor. My father yelled my name, but his voice broke completely. I turned and walked toward the heavy double doors, leaving them to drown in the silence of their own destruction. "Ensure you read the news tomorrow, Trent," I called out over my shoulder. "I hear the SEC moves very fast when you hand them a signed confession." None of them tried to stop me as I walked out into the cool night air. I got into my car and drove down the sweeping driveway, leaving the mansion and the family that had betrayed me far behind. The game was no longer about defending myself. It was about absolute financial ruin. And I had just handed Trent the rope to hang himself. The days following the intervention at my parents' house were a masterclass in arrogant stupidity. Trent and Brianna operated under the absolute delusion that they had just secured a bottomless well of wealth. Because Trent had assumed legal ownership of Aegis Holdings, he foolishly believed he could immediately leverage its supposed assets to secure new lines of credit and unfreeze his existing accounts. He did not realize that the federal government was already monitoring his every move. Instead of laying low and trying to quietly untangle the mess he had made, he and my sister went on a spectacular, reckless spending spree. I monitored their financial activity daily through my role as the lead liquidator, watching as they dug their own graves deeper with every single transaction. Brianna purchased a brand new customized luxury SUV, paying an exorbitant premium to have it delivered immediately. Trent leased a suite of high-end corporate offices in the wealthiest financial district in Atlanta, signing a 10-year lease that he absolutely could not afford. They bought designer clothes, expensive watches, and vintage champagne. They were operating on the arrogant assumption that my signature on that asset transfer document had magically erased their $2 million deficit. They truly believed they had outsmarted a forensic accountant by bullying her in a living room surrounded by church elders. Then came the grand announcement that sealed their fate. Brianna decided that their newfound supposed wealth needed to be celebrated publicly. She sent out thick gold embossed invitations to everyone in our extended family, the entire church congregation, and the wealthy elite of the Atlanta social scene. She was hosting what she called an expansion gala for her luxury event planning business. She rented the main ballroom at one of the most exclusive and expensive hotels in the city. She booked a 12-piece classical orchestra, ordered exotic floral arrangements to be flown in from overseas, and hired a celebrity chef to cater a 5-course dinner for over 300 guests. It was a $1 million party funded entirely by phantom money and fraudulent credit extensions that Trent had secured using the toxic shell company he now proudly owned. They were throwing a massive, glittering celebration on the deck of a sinking ship, and they were inviting everyone they knew to watch them go down. My mother could not resist the opportunity to publicly gloat over what she perceived as my defeat and Brianna's triumph. She took to social media to craft a masterpiece of passive-aggressive manipulation. I sat at my office desk sipping black coffee as I read the long essay she posted on her public page. She attached a professional photograph of Trent and Brianna, looking like royalty standing in front of their new luxury vehicle. My mother wrote about how incredibly proud she was of her youngest daughter and her brilliant son-in-law. She wrote about how God always rewards the faithful and how true love and family unity can overcome the vicious attacks of jealous, bitter people who try to tear down what they cannot build themselves. She never explicitly mentioned my name in the post, but the implication was painfully obvious to anyone who knew our family dynamics. She coldly stated to her thousands of followers that some people are so miserable in their own lonely lives that they try to destroy the blessings of others. She painted Trent and Brianna as holy victims who had triumphed over dark, malicious forces. The post received hundreds of likes and supportive comments within an hour. Church elders praised my parents for their steadfast faith and leadership. Aunts and uncles left prayer emojis and congratulated Brianna on her upcoming gala. My mother was basking in the digital worship, completely blind to the reality that she was cheering for two criminals who had almost cost her the very house she slept in. Reading her words, I felt no anger and no sorrow. The part of me that used to crave my parents' approval was completely gone. I no longer felt hurt by their cruelty. I only felt a clinical, cold anticipation of their impending downfall. They had chosen their side, and now they would have to live with the consequences of that choice. As the lead liquidator appointed by the bank, I had to meticulously trace exactly how Trent had structured his original fraud. The sheer audacity of his crimes was staggering. He had created multiple fake vendor accounts funneling the $2 million loan through Brianna's event planning business to make it look like legitimate corporate expenses. In reality, he was using the funds to pay off massive bad gambling debts and sustain a lavish lifestyle that neither of them could actually afford. When the money inevitably ran out, he panicked. He tried to use my parents' mansion as collateral to secure a bridge loan. When that was not enough to satisfy the lenders, he forged my signature to leverage my immaculate credit score. But the trap I laid for him was flawless. The paperwork Trent eagerly filed to claim ownership of Aegis Holdings triggered a mandatory and automatic audit by the Securities and Exchange Commission. Because Aegis Holdings was already flagged in a federal database as a toxic asset, his attempt to claim it acted like a flare gun shot into a dark sky. The federal agents did not even have to hunt for him to prove his intent. He had essentially walked right into their lobby and handed them a signed, legally binding confession. By signing over Aegis Holdings to him, I had legally tied his fraudulent venture capital firm directly to a company already under federal indictment for money laundering and massive tax evasion. He had handcuffed himself to a sinking anvil, and he was too arrogant to realize he was drowning. It was a Tuesday afternoon, exactly 3 days before Brianna's spectacular expansion gala. I was sitting in my corner office at the firm, staring out at the sprawling Atlanta skyline. The heavy glass door to my office opened and a federal agent walked in. His name was Agent Vance. He was a tall, severe man who rarely smiled and spoke with the clipped efficiency of a seasoned federal investigator. We had been working closely together for the past 2 weeks, untangling the absolute mess Trent had made of his corporate accounts and building an airtight case against his entire network. Vance did not bother with polite pleasantries. He walked directly to my desk and dropped a thick manila folder onto the polished wood surface. It looked remarkably similar to the folder Trent had used to intimidate me at my parents' house during their pathetic intervention. But the contents of this folder were real, and they were devastating. Vance sat in the leather chair opposite my desk. He crossed his legs and looked at me with a steady, clinical gaze. He told me that the joint audit was officially complete. The federal accountants had successfully traced every single stolen dollar, every forged signature, and every fraudulent wire transfer Trent had executed over the past 2 years. Vance explained that Trent's eager attempt to absorb the shell company I gave him had provided the government with the final piece of undeniable evidence they needed to prove premeditated corporate fraud. I reached out and opened the folder. Inside were dozens of pages of financial transcripts, bank statements, and highlighted ledgers proving the exact flow of the stolen money. And resting perfectly on top of the pile were 2 official court documents stamped with federal seals. Vance leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "We have the arrest warrants, Nora," he said, his voice quiet but carrying absolute authority. "The federal judge signed off on them an hour ago. We have him dead to rights on multiple counts of wire fraud, identity theft, and federal tax evasion." Vance paused, letting the silence stretch for a moment before pointing a finger at the second document. "And because your sister is listed as the primary co-director on the event planning business that received and processed the laundered funds, her name is on the second warrant. She signed the corporate tax returns, Nora. She is legally complicit in the laundering scheme." I stared at the black ink on the white paper. My sister and her husband were officially federal fugitives waiting to be apprehended. The weight of the moment settled heavily over my shoulders. I had spent my entire life trying to protect my family, trying to earn their basic respect by doing the right thing. I had worked grueling night shifts to pay for my own education so I would not be a burden. I had suffered their insults, their comparisons, and their constant belittlement in silence. And when I tried to save them from a manipulative con artist who was actively trying to steal their home, they threw me to the wolves. They called me bitter. They called me mentally unstable. They told me I was a selfish spinster who did not belong in their perfect family. Deidre and Calvin knew Trent forged my signature, and they defended him anyway. They looked me in the eye and told me I owed them my credit, my career, and my future, just so Brianna could keep playing pretend in a world she did not earn. Vance watched me carefully. He knew this was my family. He knew the complex emotional toll this had to be taking on me despite my outward calm. He slid the file a fraction of an inch closer to my hands. "We are ready to move right now, Nora," he said smoothly. "We have a tactical team standing by. When do you want to execute them? We can pick them up at their new corporate office tomorrow morning. We can pull them over in traffic on their way to lunch. We can knock on the door of their luxury condo tonight. It is entirely your call." I looked down at the federal warrants bearing the names of my sister and my brother-in-law. I thought about the extravagant $1 million gala Brianna was currently planning using stolen funds. I thought about my mother's smug social media post bragging about their holy triumph over bitter, jealous people. I thought about my father threatening to use his church connections to destroy my career because I refused to be a sacrificial lamb for his precious golden child. I thought about the aunt who accused me of withholding grandmother's pearls just to ruin a wedding. They wanted to put on a grand show for the entire city of Atlanta. They wanted everyone they knew to gather in one room and see exactly how perfect, wealthy, and untouchable they were. They thrived on public perception and social dominance. I slowly closed the manila folder and pushed it back across the desk toward Agent Vance. I looked the federal investigator directly in the eyes. I leaned back in my leather chair, feeling an absolute profound sense of peace settle deep into my bones. The girl who used to cry over her parents' conditional love was completely dead, and the woman who replaced her was not feeling merciful. At their gala, I said, my voice perfectly level and cold, "I want you to execute the warrants at their expansion gala this Friday night. I want the federal agents to walk right through the front doors of that hotel ballroom. I want the church elders to see it happen. I want my parents' country club friends to watch them be placed in handcuffs. I want the orchestra playing and the champagne flowing when you read them their rights. I want the whole city to watch." Vance did not blink. A slow, approving nod was his only reaction. He picked up the folder and tucked it under his arm, standing up from the leather chair. He told me he would brief the tactical team and coordinate with local law enforcement to ensure the hotel was properly secured. He told me it would be a very public, very loud operation. I told him I expected nothing less. As Vance walked out of my office, I turned my chair back toward the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. The sun was beginning to set, casting long golden shadows across the buildings below. Brianna and Trent had wanted a night they would never forget. They wanted a celebration that would cement their status in the elite circles of Atlanta society forever. I took a sip of my cold black coffee and smiled at my reflection in the glass. I was going to give them exactly what they wanted. It was going to be the event of the season. Thursday night descended on Atlanta with a heavy, humid heat that clung to the glass walls of my penthouse. I stood by the window looking down at the endless river of headlights bleeding into the downtown streets. Tomorrow was the expansion gala. Tomorrow, my sister and her fraudulent husband were planning to host the most extravagant party of the season, funded entirely by stolen money and blind arrogance. My apartment was silent except for the low hum of the central air conditioning. I had spent the last 48 hours finalizing the liquidation protocols and coordinating with Agent Vance to ensure that the federal raid would go off without a single flaw. The trap was set and the steel jaws were ready to snap shut. I was pouring myself a glass of sparkling water when the security buzzer echoed through the quiet space. I walked over to the monitor by the front door and looked at the screen. My father was standing in the hallway. Pastor Calvin was dressed in a tailored charcoal blazer and crisp dark trousers, looking every bit the wealthy spiritual leader he pretended to be. His face was set in a mask of solemn dignity, but his eyes betrayed a nervous energy that he could not quite hide. I took a slow breath and unlocked the door. I did not offer a greeting. I simply opened the heavy wood and waited for him to speak. He stepped inside and looked around my foyer with that familiar expression of mild distaste. He had always hated my apartment because he had not paid for it, and because it was a tangible reminder that I did not need his money to survive. He cleared his throat and offered me a sad, patronizing smile. He told me he had come to offer me one final chance at redemption. He walked past me into the living room, acting as though he owned the space, as though his mere presence was a blessing I should be grateful to receive. I closed the door and followed him, keeping a safe distance. My father turned around and clasped his hands together in front of his chest. He adopted his Sunday morning preaching voice, the one designed to make congregations weep and empty their wallets. He told me that tomorrow night was going to be the most important evening of my sister's life. He said Brianna had worked incredibly hard to build her event planning empire and that the expansion gala would secure her place in Atlanta society forever. He looked at me with an expression of profound pity. He said he knew I was hurting. He said he knew my actions over the past few weeks were just a cry for attention from a lonely woman who felt left behind. I stood perfectly still and let him speak. I let him spin his web of delusion because I wanted to hear exactly how far he was willing to go to protect a criminal. He took a step closer and lowered his voice to a gentle whisper. He offered me what he called a family olive branch. He said that if I came to the gala tomorrow night and publicly apologized to Trent in front of the church elders and the extended family, they would let me sit at the family table. He promised that if I humbled myself and admitted that I had overreacted due to stress and jealousy, the family would welcome me back into the fold. He told me that God commands us to forgive, and that he was willing to extend his pastoral grace to me, even after I had tried to maliciously ruin his son-in-law. I looked at the man who was supposed to protect me. I looked at the man who had gladly watched his favorite daughter and her con artist husband use my name to secure a $2 million fraudulent loan. He was asking me to bow down to a thief, just so he could maintain the illusion of a perfect family. I told him absolutely not. I told him I would not apologize to Trent tomorrow or any other day. I told him I would not be attending the gala to grovel at the feet of a man who was actively destroying our family. The false compassion melted off my father's face in an instant. The benevolent pastor vanished, replaced by a furious, arrogant man who could not stand being told no by a woman he viewed as inferior. His face twisted into a snarl, and he pointed a shaking finger at me. He raised his voice until it echoed off the high ceilings of my penthouse. He told me I was a bitter, miserable spinster who was completely out of her depth. He said I was a pathetic single black woman who was trying to tear down a beautiful, perfect interracial marriage out of pure spite. The sheer venom in his words was staggering. He told me I was jealous because Trent was a wealthy, successful white man who elevated Brianna to a status I could never achieve. He threw Trent race in my face as though it were a weapon, a shield of superiority that made the man completely untouchable. My father actually believed that Trent's proximity to whiteness made him inherently better than me. He worshipped the very privilege that Trent was using to rob him blind. My father took another step toward me, his chest heaving with rage. He told me that if I did not show up tomorrow and kiss the ground Trent walked on, he would personally ensure that my life in this city was over. He threatened to use Trent's massive network of old money connections to have me blacklisted from the entire corporate sector. He said men like Trent do not lose to women like me. He said Trent had friends in high places, judges, bankers, politicians who would gladly crush a rogue accountant to protect one of their own. He told me I was nothing compared to the power Trent wielded. I did not yell back. I did not cry. I just stared at him, feeling a profound sense of emptiness. He was so thoroughly colonized in his own mind that he could not see the parasite sucking the lifeblood out of his legacy. He was threatening his own daughter to protect a man who had forged my signature and put his mansion up for collateral. He was in the middle of telling me how I would die alone and impoverished when a sharp electronic chime cut through the air. The sound came from my laptop sitting open on the kitchen island. It was a high-priority alert from the banking liquidation software I had been monitoring all week. My father paused mid-rant, annoyed by the interruption. I ignored him and walked over to the marble counter. I looked at the screen and felt a cold, terrifying laugh bubble up in my chest. The sheer audacity of what I was looking at defied all logic. I stared at the flashing red notification on the banking portal. Trent was currently attempting to execute a massive wire transfer. The amount was for $250,000. The destination account belonged to the celebrity chef and the exotic floral vendor Brianna had hired for the gala tomorrow night. Trent was desperately trying to pay the vendors before they refused to show up for the event. But it was the origin account that made my blood run absolutely cold. Trent was not using his management firm accounts because those were frozen. He was not using his personal accounts because those were empty. He had somehow gained administrative access to the primary financial holdings of my father's megachurch. Trent was actively attempting to liquidate the church pension fund. He was trying to steal the retirement savings of thousands of elderly parishioners to pay for champagne and caviar at a fake expansion gala. I looked up from the screen and looked at my father. He was still standing in my living room, breathing heavily and waiting for me to respond to his racist and sexist threats. I turned the laptop around so the screen faced him. I told him to come look at the power his untouchable son-in-law wielded. My father frowned and walked over to the kitchen island. He looked down at the screen. I pointed to the origin account listed on the wire transfer request. I watched his eyes scan the numbers. I watched the exact moment his brain registered the account routing details. The account belonged to his church. The account held the future security of the very people who trusted him with their spiritual and financial lives. I explained exactly what he was looking at. I kept my voice calm and clinical. I told him that his brilliant, wealthy white son-in-law was currently attempting to drain $250,000 from the church pension fund to pay for Brianna's party tomorrow night. I told him that Trent had run out of shell companies to steal from and had now resorted to robbing the congregation. My father gripped the edge of the marble counter. His knuckles turned white. He stared at the flashing red numbers as if they were written in a foreign language. He opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came out. The arrogant pastor who had just threatened to destroy my life was suddenly reduced to a trembling old man staring at the collapse of his entire world. I turned the laptop back to face me. I told my father that as the legally appointed liquidator for the frozen assets, I was the only person who had the authority to approve or deny large-scale transfers associated with Trent's flagged financial network. I moved the cursor over the bright red button on the screen, the button labeled Deny Transaction and Report to Federal Authorities. My father let out a strange choked sound. He reached a hand out toward the computer. He begged me to stop. He told me that if the vendors did not get paid, the gala would be ruined and Brianna would be humiliated in front of the entire city. He was actually asking me to let Trent steal the church pension money, just to save my sister from public embarrassment. His sickness ran so deep that he was willing to sacrifice his own congregation to maintain the illusion of his daughter's success. I looked at him with absolute disgust. I pressed down on the trackpad and clicked the red button. A green checkmark appeared on the screen confirming that the wire transfer had been blocked and the attempted theft had been logged directly into the federal evidence file. The caterers would not be paid. The florists would not be paid. The gala tomorrow night was going to be a spectacular, catastrophic failure. My father staggered backward as if I had physically struck him. He clutched his chest, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps. He realized that the money was gone. He realized that Trent was not a savior, but a parasite who had just tried to destroy the church. But I was not finished. I opened a second tab on the banking portal. I told my father that his visit tonight had clarified a lot of things for me. I told him that I had been debating whether or not to give him and my mother a warning about the collateral Trent had used to secure his original fraudulent loan. I had wondered if I owed them a chance to prepare themselves for the fallout. But after listening to him call me a failure, after listening to him weaponize my race and my gender to prop up a thief, I realized I owed them absolutely nothing. I pulled up the digital foreclosure authorization forms. I reminded my father that Trent had used the deed to the family mansion as collateral for the $2 million loan that was now in total default. I told him that because Trent had signed the asset transfer document earlier this week, legally claiming responsibility for the toxic shell company, the bank was calling in all debts immediately. I told my father that I was executing my final duty for the evening. I moved the cursor over the final approval box. My father fell to his knees on the hardwood floor of my kitchen. He clasped his hands together and began to weep. He begged me not to take the house. He begged me to find another way to fix the numbers. He told me he was sorry for what he had said. He told me he loved me. The words were utterly meaningless. They were the desperate lies of a man who only knew how to manipulate. I did not feel an ounce of sympathy. I looked down at the man who had gladly thrown me to the wolves, and I clicked the final button. I initiated the absolute and immediate foreclosure on my parents' estate. The banking system generated a confirmation receipt detailing that eviction notices would be posted on their front gates within 48 hours. They were going to lose the mansion, the cars, the status, and the church. They were going to lose everything they had ever valued because they chose to worship a fraud instead of protecting their own daughter. I closed the laptop and told my father to get out of my home. I told him to go back to his mansion and pack his bags because the bank owned it now. He slowly pushed himself up from the floor, looking broken and hollow. He did not say another word as he shuffled toward the front door. He looked like a ghost, a man who had just watched his entire legacy burn to ash. He opened the door and walked out into the hallway. I closed the heavy oak door behind him and locked it securely. The silence in my penthouse returned, but this time it felt victorious. The trap had officially snapped shut. Tomorrow night, Brianna and Trent would walk into a hotel ballroom, completely unaware that their caterers were unpaid, their accounts were seized, and federal agents were waiting in the wings. Tomorrow night, the whole city would watch the golden child and her perfect husband fall from grace. And I was going to have a front row seat. The sheer magnitude of Trent's desperation was almost beautiful to witness through the cold lens of a banking portal. He had tried to siphon $250,000 in a single transaction. That was not just greedy, it was statistically idiotic. Any transfer of that size automatically triggers secondary authorization protocols, especially from a non-profit religious institution, account to a private hospitality vendor. He was panicking, thrashing wildly in the deep water, trying to grab onto anything that would keep him afloat. And he had chosen the retirement funds of elderly church members, the people who had trusted my father to shepherd their lives. My father's reaction to that realization was etched permanently into my memory. The way his shoulders slumped, the way the color drained from his face, leaving him looking pale and fragile. For his entire life, Pastor Calvin had used his booming voice and his commanding physical presence to bully everyone around him into submission. He used scripture as a weapon and his title as a shield. But standing in my kitchen looking at the undeniable digital proof of his son-in-law's treachery, all his power had evaporated. He could not preach his way out of a federal wire fraud attempt. He could not intimidate a banking server. When he had begged me not to take the house, he had finally shown his true priorities. He did not beg me to save the church money. He did not beg me to forgive him for his vile insults. He begged me to save the brick-and-mortar monument to his own ego. The mansion was the only thing that truly mattered to him because it was the physical manifestation of his success. Without it, he was just another man. I thought about Brianna and how she would react when the foreclosure notice was hammered onto the front gates of the estate. She had spent her entire life floating on the financial cushions provided by our parents and later by the illusion of Trent's wealth. She had never worked a day in her life that did not involve spending someone else's money. The expansion gala was supposed to be her crowning achievement, the moment she proved to the world that she was a brilliant businesswoman. Instead, it would be the stage for her federal indictment. Agent Vance had been very clear about her level of complicity. By signing the corporate tax returns and the operating agreements for the event planning business, she had legally tethered herself to the money laundering operation. Ignorance of the law was not a defense, especially when her signature was on the documents that authorized the movement of stolen funds. She had wanted the title of Chief Executive Officer to put on her social media profiles, but she had not understood the legal liability that came with the crown. I walked back into the kitchen and wiped down the marble island where my father had leaned. I wanted to remove any physical trace of his presence in my home. I wanted my sanctuary to remain pure and untainted by his toxic energy. I washed my hands in the sink, feeling the warm water rush over my skin, washing away the tension of the evening. Tomorrow would require immense focus and emotional discipline. I would need to walk into that hotel ballroom, surrounded by people who hated me, and maintain a facade of calm, professional detachment. I would need to watch my family be dismantled publicly and resist the urge to show any outward emotion. The ultimate revenge was not anger or screaming or tears. The ultimate revenge was cold, calculated indifference. I would watch them fall and I would not blink. The clock on the wall shifted past midnight, marking the official beginning of Friday. The day of the gala had arrived. The day of the raid. the day of the final reckoning. I turned off the kitchen lights and walked down the hallway toward my bedroom, leaving the city skyline shining brightly behind me. The storm was coming, and I was the one who controlled the thunder. The storm finally broke on Friday night in a spectacular display of false glamour and stolen wealth. The grand ballroom of the Atlanta Plaza Hotel was transformed into a glittering monument to Brianna's ego. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm, golden glow over 300 of the city's most elite residents. The room was packed with local politicians, wealthy venture capitalists, and the highest-ranking leaders from my father's megachurch. It was exactly the kind of crowd my parents spent their entire lives trying to impress. Waitstaff in crisp white tuxedos circulated with silver trays of imported caviar and vintage champagne. A 12-piece classical orchestra played softly in the corner, providing a sophisticated soundtrack to the massive ongoing fraud. Brianna was holding court near the center of the room. She was wearing a custom designer gown that cost $15,000. It was a ridiculous, shimmering creation of silk and hand-stitched pearls that trailed heavily across the polished marble floor. She laughed loudly, throwing her head back and touching the arms of powerful men, pretending she belonged in their world. Trent stood beside her, playing the role of the humble but brilliant titan of industry. He wore a bespoke velvet tuxedo and a smug expression that made my stomach turn. He was shaking hands and kissing babies, completely oblivious to the fact that the federal government was currently tracking his exact location. I walked through the heavy brass doors of the hotel lobby exactly 1 hour after the gala began. I did not wear a ball gown. I wore a custom-tailored charcoal power suit that fit me like a second skin. I wore sharp black stilettos and walked with the measured, steady pace of an executioner. I was not alone. I was flanked by 2 of the most ruthless corporate litigators in Atlanta. They carried leather briefcases containing the legal documentation that proved I was the sole administrative controller of Aegis Holdings. The heavy mahogany doors to the ballroom were propped open by 2 massive floral arrangements. I stopped at the threshold and looked at the ridiculous spectacle unfolding inside. I knew that every single flower, every drop of champagne, and every note played by the orchestra was unpaid. I knew that Trent had desperately lied to the hotel management and the vendors, assuring them that the massive wire transfer would clear first thing on Monday morning. He was gambling his entire remaining reputation on a lie, and he was dragging our family down with him. I stepped into the ballroom, and the cold authority of my entrance immediately sent ripples through the crowd. Conversations slowly died down as people turned to look at the 3 of us. We did not look like we were there to celebrate. We looked like we were there to dismantle the entire room piece by piece. My mother saw me first. She was standing near the ice sculpture chatting with a state senator. The moment her eyes locked onto mine, the fake socialite smile vanished from her face. It was replaced by a look of absolute seething hatred. She excused herself abruptly and marched across the ballroom floor, her silk dress swishing furiously around her ankles. She signaled sharply to 2 large hotel security guards stationed near the entrance, pointing a manicured finger directly at my chest. The guards stepped into my path, looking uncomfortable but determined to follow orders. My mother arrived a second later, breathing heavily and glaring at me with toxic superiority. She demanded that the guards remove me from the premises immediately. She told them I was an uninvited guest who was actively trying to ruin a private corporate event. She raised her voice just enough to ensure the surrounding guests could hear her, painting me as the unstable, jealous spinster sister who had come to cause a scene. I did not even look at her. I simply nodded to the lawyer standing on my right. He smoothly produced a crisp legal document bearing a federal stamp and handed it to the head security guard. He explained in a very calm and terrifyingly polite voice that the event was technically being hosted under the corporate umbrella of Aegis Holdings. He informed the guard that I was the legally recognized chief executive of that holding company. He gently pointed out that removing the legal owner of the corporate account that rented the ballroom would constitute a massive legal liability for the hotel. The security guard looked at the paperwork, saw the federal stamps, and immediately took 3 steps back. He apologized and returned to his post, completely ignoring my mother's frantic demands to physically throw me out. My mother stood there shaking with silent rage. She realized she had no power in this room. She turned and stormed off toward my father, who was busy entertaining the church elders near the main stage. The lights in the ballroom suddenly dimmed. A single bright spotlight illuminated the raised stage at the far end of the room. The orchestra stopped playing and a hush fell over the 300 guests. Trent walked confidently up the steps to the stage. He adjusted the cuffs of his velvet tuxedo and grabbed the microphone from its stand. He looked out over the sea of faces soaking in the silent admiration of the crowd. He was drowning in his own narcissism. He began to speak. His voice echoed through the massive speakers lining the walls. He thanked everyone for coming to celebrate the incredible expansion of his beautiful wife's event-planning empire. He talked about hard work, about faith, and about the blessings that come to those who truly believe in their own vision. He was delivering a sermon of pure, unadulterated fraud. The church elders nodded in solemn agreement, while the politicians raised their glasses in silent toasts. Then Trent's pale eyes scanned the back of the room and landed directly on me. A slow, wicked smile spread across his face. He could not resist the urge to publicly humiliate the woman he thought he had defeated. He decided to use his moment of triumph to grind me into the dirt in front of the entire city. He leaned closer to the microphone, and his voice took on a tone of mocking pastoral pity. He pointed directly at where I stood, flanked by my lawyers. He told the crowd that true success is measured by how much grace you can show to those who try to bring you down. He said they had even invited his troubled sister-in-law tonight. He told the room full of elite guests that I had been struggling with deep emotional issues and had acted out of bitter jealousy, but that he and Brianna believed in charity and absolute forgiveness. The entire ballroom turned to look at me. 300 pairs of eyes stared at the single black woman standing in the back of the room in a dark suit. A low wave of laughter rippled through the crowd. I saw my aunts and uncles chuckling behind their champagne flutes. I saw my father nodding slowly, performing the role of the weary but forgiving patriarch. Brianna stood near the stage looking at me with an expression of supreme, arrogant victory. They thought they had buried me. They thought they had stripped me of my dignity and turned me into a pathetic joke for their rich friends to laugh at. I did not flinch. I did not break eye contact with Trent. My face remained a perfect mask of cold marble. I slowly reached into the inner pocket of my charcoal blazer and pulled out my phone. Because Trent was a careless idiot who thought he was invincible, he had utilized the hotel's integrated audiovisual system without securing the local network. And because I held the administrative codes for the corporate entity that technically leased the space, I had full unhindered access to the ballroom's master control grid. Trent was preparing to deliver the final triumphant line of his speech. He took a deep breath and raised his hand. I looked down at my screen and accessed the master application. I loaded the digital file I had prepared earlier that afternoon. It contained the official federal indictment, the unsealed warrants, and the exact banking logs showing his attempt to steal the church pension fund. I tapped the screen and initiated the override sequence. The time for games was over. The execution had begun. The massive high-definition screens mounted behind the stage suddenly flickered and went entirely black. For a split second, the ballroom was plunged into an eerie silence, broken only by the confused murmurs of the wealthy guests and the sudden halt of the classical orchestra. Trent tapped his microphone, thinking it was a simple technical glitch. His arrogant smile wavered just slightly as he looked toward the sound booth in the back of the room, expecting someone to fix his grand moment. Instead, a sharp, piercing frequency whined through the main speakers, forcing several people in the front row to cover their ears. The screens exploded into a blinding blood red. The rich crimson glow bathed the entire stage, casting long, sinister shadows across Trent's velvet tuxedo and Brianna's custom silk gown. The guests gasped collectively as the red background faded to reveal perfectly crisp, blown-up images of highly classified financial documents. The first slide displayed the official banking ledgers of Brianna's event planning business, showing a massive negative balance. The second slide projected the forged asset transfer agreement with my signature magnified and a forensic analysis overlay, proving it was a cheap digital copy. The third and most damning slide showed a live capture of Trent's holding company accounts displaying exactly $0 in legitimate liquid assets, alongside a staggering column of defaulted loans. Trent spun around to look at the screens, and all the color instantly drained from his face. He looked like a man who had just stepped on a landmine. He frantically waved at the control booth, yelling without a working microphone for someone to cut the power to the projectors. I walked forward down the center aisle of the ballroom. The crowd parted for me like the Red Sea, sensing the absolute authority radiating from my tailored charcoal suit and the two corporate litigators walking silently behind me. The sound engineer, who I had thoroughly briefed earlier that afternoon, stepped out from his booth and handed me a sleek wireless microphone. I gripped the cool metal and brought it to my lips. My voice echoed through the cavernous ballroom, cutting through the rising panic with cold, surgical precision. "Trent is not a venture capitalist," I announced to the 300 guests, whose faces were now turned toward me in absolute shock. "He is not a financial genius, and he is certainly not a savior. He is a desperate con artist who drained $2 million from my parents' personal accounts, forged my signature to secure fraudulent bridge loans, and ruined everything he touched." The entire room erupted into chaos. Politicians dropped their champagne flutes. Wealthy investors began whispering frantically to their spouses. My mother let out a loud, dramatic wail from across the room, pretending to faint against a cocktail table. But no one paid attention to her performance anymore. My father stood frozen near the stage, his face completely ashen as he realized I was not bluffing. I took another step toward the stage, projecting my voice over the noise. I told the crowd to look closely at the newest slide appearing on the screen. The document changed to reveal a highly classified wire transfer request, stamped with a bright red denied seal. I told the room that as of 8:00 tonight, Trent had exhausted all his stolen funds. I explained that in a final act of utter desperation, he had attempted to execute an unauthorized transfer of $250,000 to pay for the exotic flowers and the celebrity catering they were currently enjoying. I paused, letting the silence stretch for a fraction of a second before delivering the fatal blow. I looked directly at the cluster of senior church elders sitting near the front row. I told them that the origin account for that blocked wire transfer did not belong to Trent or Brianna. I told them he had attempted to steal the retirement funds of Pastor Calvin's entire congregation. A collective roar of outrage tore through the ballroom. An elderly deacon standing near the stage actually lunged forward, grabbing the edge of the platform and demanding to know if I was telling the truth. Women who had trusted my father with their spiritual and financial guidance began shouting in horror. They realized that the glittering chandelier above their heads and the caviar on their plates were supposed to be paid for with their life savings. Brianna could not handle the destruction of her perfect image. She shoved past Trent and stormed to the edge of the stage. Her $15,000 gown dragged heavily behind her, snagging on a microphone stand. She did not care that her microphone was dead. She screamed at the top of her lungs so loud that her voice cracked and echoed over the outrage of the crowd. "She is lying," Brianna shrieked, pointing a shaking manicured finger at me. "She is just a bitter, jealous spinster. She has always hated me because I am beautiful and successful. She is just jealous that I got a diamond ring and a wealthy husband, and she got nothing but a lonely apartment. Do not look at those screens. She is insane. She is trying to ruin my special night because she knows she will never be as loved as I am." She stood there chest heaving, convinced that playing the victim would save her. She honestly believed that her pageant tears and her bridal purity would magically erase federal banking records. She thought the world worked the same way our childhood home did, where a few fake sobs from the golden child automatically made me the villain. I did not raise my voice to match her hysterics. I simply looked down at my phone and swiped to the next slide in my presentation. The giant screens behind her flashed again, bringing up a new set of documents that dwarfed her physical presence on the stage. I spoke calmly into the microphone, addressing the furious crowd. I told them that my sister was entirely correct about one thing. I told them she did indeed have a very expensive ring and a very expensive business. I pointed to the screen, which now displayed the official tax records and corporate filings for Brianna's luxury event planning company. I explained that her glamorous business had not paid a single cent in state or federal taxes in over 3 years. I showed the ledgers proving that her company had 0 legitimate paying clients. I walked the crowd through the highlighted arrows on the screen, tracing the exact flow of money. I showed them how the funds went directly from the weekly church donation plates straight into her corporate account. I revealed how the offerings meant for the poor and the community were systematically funneled to pay for her customized luxury SUV, her designer wardrobe, and the very $15,000 gown she was currently wearing to scream at me. The sheer precision of the financial evidence left absolutely no room for debate or manipulation. The congregation members in the room stared at the screen, seeing their tithes and sacrificial offerings transformed into line items for vintage champagne and personal vacations. The illusion of my parents' wholly successful dynasty completely shattered in real time under the harsh, glaring light of empirical data. Brianna looked at the screen and physically staggered backward, as if the numbers had struck her in the face. She looked out at the crowd, expecting someone to rush to her defense, expecting my mother to intervene or an elder to pray over her. But the faces staring back at her were filled with absolute, unadulterated disgust. Trent realized that the room had become a trap. The arrogant titan of industry was completely gone, replaced by a cornered rat sweating through his velvet tuxedo. He looked at the exit doors at the back of the ballroom, and then looked at the heavy brass doors leading to the kitchen. He knew the numbers on the screen were not just embarrassing, they were a guaranteed prison sentence. He dropped his dead microphone, letting it clatter loudly against the wooden stage floor. He began shouting wildly for his rented security team, demanding they escort him out of the building. He grabbed Brianna's arm, roughly trying to pull her off the stage, but her heavy silk dress was caught under her own heels. She stumbled and fell to her knees, weeping hysterically as the reality of her ruin finally penetrated her delusion. Trent abandoned her without a second thought, leaving his perfect wife sobbing on the floor of her $1,000,000 party. He scrambled down the side stairs of the platform, shoving past a wealthy politician and making a desperate dash toward the main lobby doors. He did not make it very far. Just as Trent reached the center of the ballroom floor, desperately pushing through the crowd of outraged guests, the heavy mahogany double doors at the main entrance burst completely open. The loud crash silenced the screaming room. The floral arrangements that had propped the doors open were trampled under heavy combat boots. A dozen men and women poured into the grand ballroom. They were not wearing tuxedos or evening gowns. They were wearing dark windbreakers, with large yellow letters printed across the back, spelling out Federal Bureau of Investigation and Securities and Exchange Commission. They moved with frightening tactical efficiency, instantly securing every single exit and fanning out across the perimeter of the room. The clinking of champagne glasses was replaced by the heavy metallic rattle of tactical gear and handcuffs. The guests froze, parting instantly to let the federal agents through. Agent Vance walked at the front of the formation, his face a mask of stone. He walked directly past my mother, who was now truly sobbing against a wall, and stepped right into Trent's path. Trent froze, his eyes darting frantically around the room, looking for an escape that did not exist. He was breathing heavily, sweat pouring down his pale face, completely trapped under the glittering crystal chandeliers of his own making. Agent Vance did not smile. He did not gloat. He simply reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out the thick folded warrant I had approved earlier that afternoon. He looked at the sweating con artist and began to read him his rights, his voice carrying clearly over the dead silent ballroom. The ultimate payoff had arrived, and the night was just getting started. The federal agents swarmed the stage, moving with a terrifying mechanical precision that completely shattered the velvet rope illusion of Brianna's gala. There was no elegant way to conduct a federal raid, and Agent Vance made absolutely no effort to spare my family any embarrassment. Two heavily armed agents grabbed Trent by the shoulders of his bespoke velvet tuxedo and forced his hands behind his back. The sharp metallic click of the handcuffs echoing across the silent ballroom was the sweetest sound I had ever heard. Trent did not face his downfall with dignity. The moment the cold steel locked around his wrists, the arrogant titan of industry completely vanished. He turned into a sniveling, desperate coward. He began thrashing against the agents, his face turning a blotchy purple as he screamed into the crowd. He did not ask for a lawyer. He did not invoke his right to remain silent. Instead, he immediately tried to throw his own wife under the bus. He twisted his body toward the center of the room, pointing a shaking finger directly at Brianna. He screamed that it was not his fault. He yelled that she knew everything about the shell companies and the forged documents. He told the federal agents that Brianna was the one who demanded the luxury SUV, the expensive vacations, and the $1 million party. He shrieked that she was the primary director on the accounts and that she knew. He screamed that her parents knew and that they were the ones who willingly gave him the money to keep up their pathetic appearances. Brianna stood frozen in her $15,000 gown, her mouth open in a silent scream of horror. The man she had paraded around as her savior, the wealthy white prince she had used to humiliate me for years, was now viciously feeding her to the wolves to save his own skin. But Trent was not finished. His eyes darted through the crowd of horrified guests until he found my parents. Pastor Calvin and First Lady Deidre were shrinking back against the catering tables, desperately trying to blend into the shadows. Trent lunged against the agents holding him, pointing his cuffed hands toward my father. He told the entire ballroom that Pastor Calvin was a corrupt hypocrite who was perfectly fine with draining the church pension fund as long as it kept his precious daughter dripping in diamonds. The reaction in the room was instantaneous and explosive. The polished high society veneer of the gala completely disintegrated. The senior church elders who had spent the last decade treating my father like an infallible spiritual king suddenly turned on him with the ferocity of a betrayed mob. These were men and women in their 60s and 70s who had just realized that their retirement savings, their medical funds, and their grandchildren's inheritances had been stolen to pay for exotic flowers and imported caviar. An older man named Deacon Harris, who had known me since I was a little girl, shoved his way through the crowd and grabbed my father by the lapels of his expensive suit. He demanded to know where the pension money was. He screamed at my father, asking how he could stand on a pulpit every Sunday and preach about integrity while allowing a con artist to rob the congregation blind. My father stammered and choked on his words, raising his hands in a pathetic attempt to calm the furious elders. He tried to use his pastoral voice to preach peace and understanding, but no one was listening to his lies anymore. The illusion of his spiritual authority was completely dead. Meanwhile, two female agents approached Brianna. They informed her that there was a federal warrant for her arrest regarding her complicity in wire fraud and money laundering. Brianna finally snapped out of her paralyzed shock and went into a full-blown toddler meltdown. She began backing away, shaking her head and batting at the agents' hands as if they were pesky insects. She shrieked that they could not arrest her because she was hosting a gala. She yelled that her dress cost $15,000 and that they were going to ruin the silk fabric. The agents did not care about her dress. They grabbed her arms and efficiently spun her around, forcing her wrists together. Brianna wailed, dropping to her knees and forcing the agents to physically drag her across the polished marble floor. Her perfect hair unraveled, her heavy makeup smeared in black streaks down her cheeks, and the shimmering pearls on her gown scraped violently against the ground. The guests she had invited to witness her grand triumph were now pulling out their cell phones to record her being dragged out in handcuffs. She had wanted to be the center of attention, and she finally was. My mother watched her golden child being hauled away like a common criminal and absolutely lost her mind. Deidre had spent her entire life curating a flawless image of wealth and superiority. She had weaponized Brianna's fake success to make me feel small and unworthy. Now her masterpiece was completely destroyed. She looked around the chaotic ballroom, seeing her husband cornered by furious elders and her beloved son-in-law crying in federal custody. She realized in a matter of seconds that her entire kingdom had fallen. Then her eyes found me. I was still standing near the back of the ballroom, flanked by my corporate litigators, perfectly calm and completely untouchable. I was the only person in the room who held any actual power. My mother broke away from the angry mob surrounding my father and sprinted across the ballroom floor. She pushed past politicians and wealthy socialites, completely abandoning her refined persona. She practically threw herself at me, grabbing my forearms with a desperate, frantic grip. Her manicured fingernails dug into the sleeves of my charcoal suit. Her eyes were wide and wild, filled with a terrifying, completely unearned sense of entitlement. "Nora, do something," she begged, shaking my arms violently. "You have money. Save us. We are your blood." She shrieked the words as if biology somehow erased decades of emotional abuse and financial betrayal. She demanded that I use my connections to call off the agents to pay back the pension fund, to somehow wave a magic wand and restore her broken reality. I looked down at my mother's desperate hands gripping my arms. I felt absolutely nothing for her. No pity, no anger, no sadness. She only remembered that I was her blood when she needed a shield to hide behind. She had watched me struggle and work myself to the bone for years, never offering a single word of encouragement. She had watched my sister and her husband forge my signature and steal my identity, and she had told me to be a good Christian and let them get away with it. She had publicly humiliated me just hours ago, trying to have me thrown out of this very room by security. And now she expected me to swoop in and be her savior. I gently but firmly pried her hands off my suit. I took a deliberate step back, putting a physical distance between my reality and her delusion. "Save you?" I asked, my voice cold and dangerously quiet, cutting through her hysterical sobbing. I looked her directly in the eyes. I told her she fundamentally misunderstood the situation. I reminded her that I did not create this nightmare, she did. I reminded her that she had happily enabled a fraud because she cared more about having a wealthy white son-in-law than she cared about her own daughter's future. My mother shook her head frantically, tears spilling over her eyelashes. She begged me again, telling me that they were going to lose everything. She sobbed that they were going to be ruined. She pleaded with me to use my wealth to save them because they were my family. I allowed a slow, cold smile to touch my lips. I looked at my mother and delivered the final, absolute truth of the evening. "Save you? Mom, you co-signed Trent's loans using your house," I told her, watching the blood drain from her face. "The bank seized it this morning." My mother gasped, her hand flying to her mouth as the reality of her impending homelessness finally sank in. She stared at me with wide, terrified eyes, waiting for me to offer some kind of financial lifeline to tell her I would fix it. But I was not finished. I leaned in slightly, making sure she heard every single word over the noise of the chaotic ballroom. I told her that the bank did not just seize the house. They sold the debt to the highest immediate bidder to clear the toxic ledger. "I bought the debt," I said softly. I watched the realization slowly crawl across her face. I watched her brain try to process the fact that the daughter she had deemed socially unfit, the daughter she had mocked and belittled and thrown away, was now the sole legal owner of her entire existence. I told her that because I bought the debt, I now held the absolute legal title to the sprawling brick mansion she loved more than anything in the world. I owned the manicured lawns, the heated swimming pool, and the heavy double doors where they had ambushed me just a few days ago. I owned the ground she walked on, which means, I said, my voice perfectly smooth and devoid of any mercy, you have until Monday morning to pack your bags and vacate my property. My mother stopped breathing. She simply stood there, paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of her defeat. The woman who had spent decades making me feel like a guest in my own family was now officially a trespasser in my house. She slowly sank to the floor, her expensive silk dress pooling around her as she finally understood that the game was over. She had bet everything on the golden child and she had lost spectacularly. I did not wait to watch her cry. I turned my back on her and adjusted the cuffs of my suit. I signaled to my lawyers and we walked together toward the exit of the grand ballroom. Behind me, the federal agents were reading Brianna her rights as they hauled her out the side doors. The church elders were still shouting at my ruined father, and the wealthy elite of Atlanta were scrambling to distance themselves from the radioactive fallout of the Wilson family. I walked out through the heavy brass doors of the hotel and stepped into the cool, humid night air of the city. The flashing red and blue lights of the police cruisers illuminated the dark street, painting the world in the colors of consequence. The trap I had laid was a complete and absolute success. My family had demanded a grand stage to show off their power, and I had simply turned on the lights so everyone could see the rot hiding underneath. I got into my waiting car and told the driver to take me home, leaving the wreckage of their arrogance far behind in the rearview mirror. I clicked the button and brought the whole house down. Sometimes the people meant to protect you cause the deepest harm. This story shows that family is not defined by blood, but by genuine respect. You owe no loyalty to those who exploit your kindness or diminish your achievements to elevate their own status. Finding the courage to enforce strict boundaries and build your own financial independence is the ultimate act of self-love. Walking away from a toxic dynamic gives you the freedom to thrive. Have you ever had to walk away from toxic relatives to protect your peace? Share your experiences in the comments below and subscribe today.